Available worldwide. Streaming radio at linkfm.co.za.
Oh, yes, indeed. It is Word and World Time right here on Link FM, linking people to Jesus. And today we're talking the United Nations International Day of Democracy, which was yesterday, September the 15th. And just to quote UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, the International Day of Democracy is an opportunity to reinforce the importance of upholding free speech, civil liberties, and the rule of law, ensuring accountable institutions, and protecting and promoting human rights. Now, to help us further break this down, maybe even break down this quote, is our guest now resident political analyst. His name is Craig Bailie. He is CEO of Bailie Leadership Consultancy. Craig, welcome back. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for coming through. Did you enjoy Democracy Day yesterday?
Thanks, Mr. K. Yeah, it's always good to be here. I don't know if enjoy is the appropriate word. I spent most of yesterday in front of my laptop drafting curriculum on freedom of religion or belief, and interestingly there's a relationship we've discussed four before.
We did last time we did this.
There's a relationship between that and democracy. I don't think one can have a functioning healthy democracy without freedom of religion and vice versa. You just quoted the UN Secretary General. Interestingly, many argue that the notion of human rights has its origin in religion, and more specifically the Christian faith. And as you quoted the Secretary General, we heard there that human rights is one of the fundamental pillars of a democratic dispensation. And I think it's one of the reasons it's so important that we as Christians get behind democracy, behind democratic governance, certainly within the civil governance space, and that we get behind the idea of a democratic society.
Absolutely. And what does a democratic society look like in your opinion?
Yeah, I think it's an important question. Anyone who's done any amount of reading or research on democracy will come to the conclusion that democracy is a contested idea. There's the different definitions of democracy, but I think as it is with any significant or profound terms, we need to try and grab hold of, let's call them the conceptual pillars or the foundations of this particular term. And I think if we talk about the foundations or pillars of democracy, we're talking about political competition, partly in the form of elections. We're talking about popular sovereignty. What do I mean by that? It means the decision as to who governs and how they govern ultimately rests with the people. Now we can unpack that a bit later on. That description might not sit well with the members of a faith. I'm part of that faith who believe in a sovereign God. Thirdly, we're talking about representativity. The governed are represented by the governors. Fourthly, accountability. Fifthly, the limiting or sharing of power. And then we have the rule of law, which we heard about in the quote you shared. And finally, protection of human rights. Now, anyone who spends some time considering these pillars of democracy will see that they align nicely with three fundamental biblical truths. In other words, democracy accommodates or caters for three biblical truths, being human fallibility or our fallen human nature, the fact that we possess inherent human dignity and value, and thirdly, that we possess incredible potential. Unlike any other governance system, or rather more than any other governance system, democracy accommodates those three biblical truths. And I think that's reason enough for the church in South Africa, anywhere else in the continent or the world, to throw its weight behind this form of governance, with the understanding that it is not perfect, never will be perfect, because we live in a fallen world.
Available worldwide. Streaming radio at linkfm.co.za. God is on the move. Link FM, linking people to Jesus.
So democracy, more than any other governance system, recognizes, accommodates, or caters for three biblical truths. Our human fallibility, our inherent value and dignity, and our potential. So again, if we look at those pillars of democracy, political competition invites participation. If we think about the notion of a free market, for example, although there is in reality no such thing as an entirely free market, it always has to be regulated to one degree or another. But if we think about political competition, it invites participation, which means it recognizes the ability of persons to participate with value. That's in theory. So this is why it's so important that democracy will thrive where education thrives, where the education system is of a high quality. And this is why Aristotle was so suspicious of democracy. He didn't trust it. He called it mob rule. And mob rule is what one would end up with, certainly if one is talking about a direct democracy, or else also known as majoritarianism, where it's simply a case of the majority rules. When I or any other like-minded Christian advocates for democracy, we're probably talking about a constitutional democracy, where it isn't the majority that rules, but everyone looks to an agreed upon document. Let's call it a national consensus of how we as a society should be living, should be treating one another, what should we expect of the government. And so all decisions have to be aligned with that constitution. The constitution protects both the minority, minorities, whoever those groups may be, as well as the rights of the majority. So as much as can be expected, the idea is that the constitution levels the playing field as much as possible, recognizing every citizen's inherent value and dignity. Again, a link there between democracy and what we read in Scripture. I don't want to go if we have enough time, we can go through all the pillars. But for example, accountability. Why should we see this as something of value? Because we recognize humankind's inherent sin, and that we are inclined to abuse our power, and therefore there is a need for those in power, specifically in the context of this conversation, those in government, to be held accountable by, quote unquote, the people, the citizens, the persons, the South Africans who vote. I'm far from the only person to say this, to recognize this. It's a well-known fact. South Africa's democracy is in trouble. You and I have spoken before about the GNU. There's reason to celebrate there, but the recent elections saw the lowest voter turnout since 1994. One cannot have a democracy without willing voters. And if I may quote here Victoria O'Regan of the Daily Maverick, who wrote that so many people did not vote in what were regarded as watershed elections needs great introspection. What are the figures? Of a registered voter population of 27.7 million people, only 16.2 million cast their ballots. And this particular journalist is calling for great introspection based on those figures. When I read that quote, my question is this: where is the church? Now, I've written before, I don't believe for 1 second that 86% of the South African population is Christian. That's how many of our people, of the country's people, identify as Christian. But I don't believe that that is a reflection of the number of committed Christians in our country. At the very least, I expect committed Christians to be turning out and voting come election day, because in theory, philosophically, theologically, they should understand the significance of leadership, including at the national level, and that voting day or election day is an opportunity for them to decide who occupies leadership positions at that level.
In your professional opinion, do we take, specifically in this country, as the church, do we fully appreciate the democracy that we live in?
So I've just cited figures. I think that's one potential answer to your question, one indicator as to whether we as a church appreciate democracy. I understand that those figures don't necessarily reflect Christian political behavior, but I think it's safe to assume that at least a portion of the church would constitute that number that didn't turn out to vote. Maybe this is a more accurate measure, although I don't know exactly what would have happened yesterday, but I think it's a helpful question to ask. Given that yesterday was International Day of Democracy, in how many churches across the country did someone stand up during the church service, at the beginning or at the end, and say something in support of democracy?
Why should they? Why should they have?
Well, I think the greater our revelation and understanding as the church of democracy, of its value, of the fact that democracy, as I said earlier on, more than any other governance system, accommodates biblical truths. I think the greater that revelation or understanding is, the more activism, maybe a dirty word among some church circles, but the more action we should see on the part of Christians when they gather in support of this form of governance. And I make this argument strongly, not because I believe democracy is going to usher in God's kingdom, or even to say that democracy is a reflection of God's kingdom, but rather to say that democracy, when properly pursued and applied, encourages human freedoms. And that should be enough for us as a church to support democracy, while at the same time recognizing that with the exercise of those freedoms comes responsibility. And I think that is part of what our country's constitution places before us, is the responsibility to behave, I think primarily according to biblical principles and values, but then after that also according to the principles and values we find in our constitution, many of which are in fact aligned with, I would say, biblical truths, and where they aren't, well, then we must respectfully decline the expectation that we abide by those principles and values. But I think largely when we talk about our constitution, we're talking about the rule of law, which is greatly beneficial, another pillar of our democracy. So I hope that at least to some degree, Mr. K, answers your question, why should the church be talking about democracy and supporting democracy? As I said earlier on, where we have I think the more we experience a functioning democracy, the more we can expect freedom of religion. There's another reason why I think the church should be throwing its weight behind this form of governance that we call democracy.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was really hoping you would. Because, in recent years, we've seen an increased effort in, to some degree, muzzling the church. And that's why it's so concerning to see the perceived apathy when it comes to, engaging politics, as it were, in the church. Because, like I said, it's been, and we see other examples of this as well, in the various bills that have been proposed and then passed, into law. We saw recently the basic education,
or the Bella bill signed on Friday by the president.
By the president, and many objections came, particularly from the church, from Christian political parties and the church as a whole. I mean, right here on this platform, I was encouraging those who have objections to go and engage and make those objections known at the various meetings, consultative meetings
whatever
that they
opportunities
had.
are available.
Yes, throughout the country, basically. But
if I can
it
interject
seems
there,
that didn't really have that much of an
effect. I'm not
effect.
convinced that everyone in the church is aware of those opportunities, right? And perhaps if they were, more of us would take action. So maybe part of the challenge we're facing as a church is simply communication. And that's why I asked the question, who yesterday during the church services across the country got up and spoke about democracy? Mr. K, you spoke about the church being muzzled, and I'd like us to try and create as real a picture of of what's happening in our country as possible. I wouldn't go so far as to say that the church is being muzzled. I make that statement as someone who's also working in the space of freedom of religion elsewhere in the continent. We are nowhere close to experiencing, I don't even want to use, I think in our case, it's not really persecution, but let's call it the kind of restrictions that Christians in other African countries, other parts of the world are experiencing. But I think what is happening in South Africa is an increasing encroachment on human freedoms broadly, which affect all human beings irrespective of their faith, religious groupings or a-religious groupings. And I think because of that, an indirect consequence of that is that some pastors, for example, will feel a greater amount of pressure or legal expectation to conform to legislation. If I think about the Bailie Bill, another two key aspects of democracy is subsidiarity and this idea of jurisdictional governance. So firstly, the recognition that problems are best solved at local level by people who are on the ground and who we assume know what's going on. And secondly, this notion of jurisdictional governance. We can talk about civil government, but we can also talk about church governance. We can talk about family governance. We can talk about business governance. And what needs to happen for a democracy to thrive is each of those spheres need to understand what the limits of their authority are, and they need to exercise their authority accordingly within their respective spheres. In other words, the job of governing is spread out across different spheres according to their expertise. The more a government steps over into those other spheres, the more we should expect human freedoms to decline. And my concern, the concern of other Christians, is that this is what we are seeing in South Africa.
God is on the move. Link FM, linking people to Jesus. Real life, real faith, real hope. Link FM.
Now, before we went to that song break, Craig, you gave us some stats when it comes to voter turnout and all that. Very concerning numbers that you shared. Bearing those numbers in mind, would you say, to a certain degree, democracy in this country is under threat?
Mr. K, I think it is. I think when we talk about, or when one answers that question, we're always talking on a spectrum.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to recognize how, we have been 30 years in, but in comparative terms, in historical terms, we're still a young democracy. And I'm always reluctant to actually refer to South Africa as a democracy. I think at least officially, we are a constitutional democracy or an electoral democracy. But whether that manifests as it should in practice, the question to ask is, for example, how many of our political leaders respect the Constitution? How many, quote unquote, ordinary citizens, the ordinary man on the street, I'm one of them, how many of us respect the Constitution? Or put differently, the rule of law? So certainly the declining voter turnout, the lowest this year since 94, is a signal for us. It should be an alarm bell going off concerning the health of South Africa's democracy. I'd also like to share the findings of Afrobarometer. They released their recent survey findings over a 10-year period across 30 countries. Support for democracy declined, or let me rather put it this way. South Africa, in that survey, over 10 years, South Africa alongside Mali were the two countries in which the support for democracy has declined the most. Afrobarometer survey conducted over 10 years across 30 countries shows that South Africa alongside Mali are the two countries in which the support for democracy has declined the most. Now, let me tell listeners, Mali is presently run by a military junta. All right. I think the percentage of the Malian population that is Christian is 5%. The rest are Muslim. This is for comparative purposes. In South Africa, we supposedly have 86% of the population that is Christian. Yet we sit alongside Mali when it comes to the greatest decline in support for democracy over 10 years. I think that decline in support is especially strong, not I think, studies show, among the youth. And my concern is that many South Africans, but especially the youth, are confusing the failure to vote for democratic leaders with the failure of democracy as a system of governance. One cannot have democracy where democratic leaders are not in power. And that's why it's so important that we consider our education system, including civic education. To what degree is civic education even being given in our schools? I wrote a piece 2 years ago. My conclusion was that it's virtually non-existent. Now, you can't expect citizens to vote accordingly for democratic leaders if they don't understand what democratic leadership is, if they don't understand what democracy is. And I'm concerned about, alongside that, the state of our education system. We spoke a moment ago about the Bella Bill. I believe the education system has been under attack for many years now, whether deliberately or because of ignorance. I'm inclined to lean towards the former, simply because the more educated a population is or a citizenry is, the more difficult it becomes to control that citizenry. And we need to think about that. This is why it's so important, I believe, for the church to step up, not to become a political party or political campaign office, but simply to be salt and light. And I think that includes equipping its members to engage the world around it, including in the political space.
Craig, we are nearly out of time. Parting shot? Parting shot.
May I end off with a quick quote? And I think it relates to what I've just shared from a Kenyan theologian, Professor Bernard Boyo. He writes, "Most Christians in Africa have no theological or biblical foundation to guide their involvement in politics. They have not been prepared to think biblically about what to say or do when personal, group and national interests clash, nor have they thought deeply about what is involved in living in states like South Africa, characterized by religious pluralism." So again, the question is, to what degree are church leaders or people with, and when I say church leaders, I don't mean leaders of the church. I mean leaders within the church. They don't have to be the elders.
Yeah.
But people who have the drive, the motivation, the leadership, vision and capacity to stand up and help equip their congregations in the space, let's call it church-state relations. I think the more that happens, the more support we will see for democracy in this country, and the healthier our democracy is, the more we should see human freedoms, or at least the respect for and recognition of human freedoms, expanding.
The question is, where are you? Where are we as the church? The world is changing around us. Laws are being passed, and things are happening that affect all of us. So where are we in all of this? Are we just bystanders, or are we active participants?
Real life, real faith, real hope. Link FM.